Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kelly Campbell, and I'm the Associate Director of the Institute for Child Development and Family Relations at Cal State San Bernardino. Our institute serves children, parents, and families in the inland region through research, education, and applied services. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Roderick O'Hanley, who is an assistant professor in school psychology at CSUSB. He received his bachelor's degree in psychology from CSUSB in 2011 and his PhD in school psychology from the University of Southern Mississippi. He completed his postdoctoral research training at the Monroe Meyer Institute for Genetics and Rehabilitation at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. Dr. O'Hanley has experience working in schools, in behavioral health clinics, and integrated behavioral pediatric clinics, providing care to school-age children and their families. Dr. O'Hanley's specific research interests include the assessment and treatment of social skill deficits, coaching teachers and parents to implement evidence-based interventions, and helping teachers manage classroom behavior using class-wide interventions. So with that introduction, it's my pleasure now to turn it over to Dr. O'Hanley.
The title of this is Simple and Effective Strategies for Doing This. Simple does not mean easy, though, right? And I'll try to sprinkle in examples of how these sorts of strategies can be incorporated in the classroom as well as at home to get better practice and better use out of these different strategies. So just really quickly, a rundown of some of the things I'll chat about. Talking about defining compliance, because there's different ways of viewing compliance. Talk about why it's important to improve child compliance, both at home and at school. I'll offer a brief conceptualization of like why kids do what they do, although really that sort of discussion can take up a whole semester, if not more. And then lastly, I'll talk about specific strategies to increase child compliance that are more positive in nature and don't rely on punishment. So what is noncompliance? Whenever I work with parents and teachers, I think it's important to start out with really getting a clear sense of what it is that caregivers are concerned about. There are different ways you can look at noncompliance. Some people don't like the word compliance and noncompliance. It has a connotation of like conformity and those sorts of things. You can call it different things. Task follow through, child cooperation, whatever you want to call it. Ultimately, what we're really concerned about is whether or not kids do in fact follow through when an instruction is given by a parent or teacher. As a parent or teacher, you can think about this in a couple different ways. Whereas with noncompliance, you can consider whether or not they're starting the request that you're giving to them within a specific amount of time. Some kids, they just have trouble getting started when you ask them to do things. But once they get started, they're good to go, right? That's sort of a little bit different to this definition of noncompliance being a failure to complete an instruction within a specific amount of time. So there's two subtypes here when it comes to noncompliance. There's the initiation piece, then there's the completion piece. And as you're considering how you might incorporate some of these strategies, I think it's a good place to start thinking about, well, what is it that you care about specifically? Is it getting started, kids getting started with their instructions, kids completing their instructions, and what's an appropriate amount of time for them to do those things? The contrast to noncompliance is compliance. It's incompatible with noncompliance. You can't have both. If noncompliance is a failure to initiate or complete an instruction within a specific amount of time, then compliance would be actually initiating or completing those instructions within a specific amount of time. Some parents and teachers will also voice concerns about other behaviors that occur once an instruction is given. And these could be all kinds of things. These could be just ignoring parents and teachers and continuing to engage in those other behaviors. It could be a lot of like verbal opposition, like, no, I don't want to do that, or I hate you and you're ruining my life, and all these kinds of other oppositional verbal behaviors. But again, it's important to think about like what it is that you're trying to address when using some of these strategies. These strategies that we'll go over are specifically for increasing compliance and decreasing noncompliance, but they can be used and are often used to reduce these other disruptive behaviors. But again, just it's important to think about what it is that you care about with some of these things. Sometimes kids can comply, but will still give you some verbal opposition. If you're a parent or teacher isn't really concerned about that, then okay. But if you are concerned about that verbal opposition, it just needs to be considered at the outset because you may need some other strategies as supplements to reduce some of those verbal opposition behaviors. So really, when it comes to compliance and non-compliance, it's a matter of what you think is important as a teacher or parent. But I think most people here probably have a general sense of why compliance and non-compliance are important things to address in kids. But what we know to be generally true is that non-compliance is one of the most common referral concerns for both teachers and parents working in clinics. It's the number one concern that we see in clinics. When you look at like office discipline referrals and what behaviors constituted getting a kid kicked out of class, it's usually related to not following through with some type of instruction. The reason why this matters is because non-compliance is associated with lots of detrimental immediate and long-term outcomes. We know that kids who are generally more compliant, and when I say more compliant, there's some research to show that like there's a threshold of a 40% compliance percentage as being sort of like this pivotal level. When you have kids who are compliant less than 40% of the time across settings, it tends to be more problematic. Most kids are compliant about 70 to 80% of the time, but maybe 60% depending on the context. But no kid is compliant 100% of the time, which is important to also think about too. But in any case, we know non-compliance is generally associated with poor academic outcomes, poor social development in early childhood. You can think about what this would look like in a classroom or with parents. You ask a kid to do something, they don't do it. Parents and teachers often resort to reprimands, maybe restating the command, and it turns into this punitive interaction where, hey, you should do this. Why should I do this? You should do this because I said so. Those sort of that sort of dialogue might occur. But in any case, kids who tend to be more non-compliant eventually face increased chance of experiencing teacher and peer rejection in school. And by middle childhood, what this can result in is a kid engaging with what some people call more deviant peers, basically kids who maybe engage in a few more disruptive behaviors than your average kid. And if that sort of thing continues, then in early and late adolescence, you have a kid who hasn't gotten enough instruction in the classroom to really develop the academic skills needed to perform well, are far behind academically, have experienced a lot of social rejection, and will just continue to engage in other problematic behaviors throughout adolescence, and people track this into adulthood as well. That's in contrast to compliance. But kids who follow through with teacher and parent instructions tend to have better academic outcomes and get along with peers a little bit better. And compliance is also considered keystone behavior, particularly in early childhood where kids are developing skills. There's a bunch of important skills kids have to develop pretty quickly: potty training, eating, establishing bedtime routines, and being able to sleep through the night. Those are all skills that kids need to learn, and parents are going to be in a better position when they have a kid who can follow through with basic instructions more so than not. This is like a really, really maybe overly simplified conceptualization of why people do what they do. Like, it's not just kids. This is really everybody, honestly. So you can think about some of these strategies that we'll talk about. They're for kids, but maybe you want to use them with your significant others. I don't know. It might be effective with them too. But in general, here's what we know tends to be true. When considering what kids' behavior looks like, you can think about that in terms of compliance, non-compliance, verbal opposition, any sort of motor behavior. There are usually things that come before those behaviors that kind of trigger those behaviors. These are antecedent events or antecedent variables, things that come before the behavior. Those things, if they trigger behavior, kids are going to do things that give them the biggest bang for their buck. And on the other side of behavior, we have consequences. You can think of this stuff as, you don't think of consequences not necessarily good or bad, just that they do occur. Consequences come after behavior, and there's two general reasons why kids do what they do, whether it's good behavior or bad behavior. You can break it down into two categories. It's either to get something or to get out of having to do something. It's one of those two things always, or maybe a combination of those things. Some examples of what that might look like are maybe to get access to somebody's attention, maybe to continue engaging in an activity that they're already currently engaged in, maybe to get access to some other tangible object or some type of food, or maybe just to escape or avoid people. Like, I don't want to be around these people, so I'm going to work to get out of having to be around these people. I don't want to follow through with this instruction, so I'm going to work to get out of having to follow through with this instruction by throwing maybe a little temper tantrum and argue with a parent. And all the while, you're just delaying having to follow through with these instructions. Okay, so overly simplified, but the reason why I mention this is because it does offer a conceptualization to the evidence-based interventions that are used to address some of these concerns. So this is like a really just a general flow chart incorporating the A's, the antecedents, behaviors, and consequences sort of conceptualization to compliance and non-compliance. So to start, parents and teachers might give a kid an instruction. We'll talk about like how you can change instructions to increase the chances of compliance, but if the antecedent variable is an instruction, then there's really only two outcomes that you can have with regards to what you want the kid to do. Compliance, whether that's initiate or complete the activity in a certain amount of time. And then the other option is non-compliance. It's one of these two things. We have the antecedent here, a behavior that might occur here, and then consequences. If we think about behavior in terms of these antecedents, behaviors, consequences, you can start to see maybe a little bit clearer why kids actually do what they do when you look at what it is they get out of compliance versus non-compliance. Most parents and teachers do offer some sort of acknowledgement for compliance. At some level they do, right? Maybe some like, hey, thanks for listening. Hey, thanks for following through. Hey, you did a good job listening today. Here's a prize or a present or a toy of some kind. Parents do this fairly often, but if you can think of a kid who is more often non-compliant, it's worth considering whether or not they get better value out of being non-compliant than what they get for being compliant with your instructions. When kids are non-compliant, really by definition, they're escaping and avoiding an instruction that they don't want to complete, right? For whatever reason, maybe they just don't like the task. Maybe they would get access to something else, like if you're giving an instruction while a kid is currently playing, right? Maybe they're going to want to continue playing, so they're not going to comply. They continue with the current activity, whatever it is, right? I think it's useful to think about this in terms of what it is kids get out of their different behaviors. Even if parents offer praise and tangibles and other sort of incentives, if you have a kid that's more often non-compliant, what is usually true, is that the kids are placing a higher value on what it is that they get out of for being non-compliant. And at the very least, most parents, by the time they come into clinics, most teachers, by the time they come and seek consultation, like behavioral consultation in the classroom, we know that kids' access or teachers and parents' delivery of some of these incentives for compliance is usually not as consistent or as predictable as what they might get for being non-compliant. So value is usually higher here, but even if it's not, most kids learn that access to some of these other things is more consistent than the access they might maybe not get for being compliant with adult instructions. So value is typically lower, and at the very least, access is much less consistent to things that might incentivize more compliant behavior versus non-compliance. Value is almost always high and at the very least more consistent. One thing that's worth mentioning here too, though, with regards to non-compliance is what most people respond with are things like reprimands, maybe even threats like, hey, if you don't do this, you're going to get sent out, or hey, wait till your dad gets home or your mom gets home or something like that, right? Or if you don't do this, you're going to lose out on things. And those sorts of things just really contribute back to that coercive parent, teacher, child interaction where it's just, there's not a really strong relationship there, right? Most parents also maybe repeat the instructions multiple times, maybe lose their patience, right? go do this, go do this, go do this becomes a little bit more repetitive. Instructions become a little bit louder. The reprimands become louder. All this really means that is what you end up being left with using strategies like this are power struggles, maybe worse parent, teacher, child relationships in development. Ultimately, the strategies that we know to be effective really involve asking the question, well, what can we do here before or during the time we're asking kids to do stuff to make sure that they follow this pathway? Okay, so are there things that we can do here to make this, to increase the chances this occurs? And given what we know that values tends to be higher here, if not more consistent than it is here, the strategies that are considered evidence-based for addressing these concerns really involve flipping the value that kids find here to over here, creating some sort of contrast, so to speak, between what they get here and what they get here. If value is really high here, we want to flip this so that value is high and consistent here. Usually we try to make it so that value is lower here for non-compliant behavior and less consistent. But the strategies that we're actually going to go over today don't really address the value that kids get out of non-compliant behavior. To do that, you would use something like timeout. But the strategies that we're focusing on here are really more about how can we increase the value of the incentives for compliant behavior and increase access so that kids follow through with the instructions that we give them at home and at school. Okay, so there's a few different types of parent and behavior management training programs. All of them really have similar components, though, that are listed here. Time in is what I think of when I think of like establishing more positive incentives in the kids' environment, developing a good positive relationship with them. This will look, we're actually going to talk about how to set this up a little bit, but it also involves providing them more positive feedback when they do follow through with instructions. Then there's effective instruction delivery, which is EID for short, which really just involves changing how an instruction is given to increase the chances kids follow through. And then probably the most intrusive and most intensive, usually for parents and teachers, is the use of a timeout procedure. Timeout would be used in response to non-compliance. Timeout is really honestly its own discussion that could take an hour or two. We're not really going over timeout, but when I think of timeout, though, as being the last strategy that's employed, it's really because we want to focus on more positive strategies first. And as we establish better time in, like a more positive environment for kids, more reason for them to follow through, it can make timeout more effective because now they lose out on more things that they value. Okay, but what we're focusing on are these two things here. When parents and teachers can do this more consistently and somewhat systematically on some level, of course, you get an increase in compliance, a decrease in non-compliance. Ultimately, we're trying to establish better self-control skills for kids. So these aren't the sort of things that necessarily need to be used forever and always. Eventually, they get faded out as kids develop these better self-control skills. But what you also get are few power struggles, right? Fewer coercive and negative interactions between teachers, parents, and kids. So there's lots of benefits, not just for kids, but for teachers as well. Maybe less stress for parents and teachers too, right? When kids follow through, it just makes life a little bit easier. As a parent of a 4.5-year-old, anecdotally, I can speak to this, right? Here's some things to think about, though, as you're considering how you might use some of these strategies, either at home or at school. First and foremost is, are the instructions and the requests that you're giving to kids developmentally and age appropriate, right? There are some things that maybe you wouldn't expect a kid to do, and yet we often find in clinics, like parents have these somewhat unreasonable expectations for what they expect of their kids. Things related to sleep, things related to feeding, potty training even. Secondly, does the kid have the skills needed to complete the tasks that you're asking of them? Right? Like, you're not asking kids to go outside and mow the lawn, even if they had the skills necessarily. But if you were asking them to do that, can they actually do it? Right? Probably not. Right? If you're thinking about young kids, don't do that, by the way. Just don't do that. It's just an example. But you think in the classroom, like with teachers, oftentimes teachers wonder, like, well, why is it this kid's not on task and following through with the academic instructions I'm giving them? And it's always worth asking, well, do they even have the skills needed to complete these math worksheets or in-class assignments or even homework assignments independently? And if they don't, then those skills need to be addressed first, right? So if they don't have the skills, it's not even worth asking them to do. Lastly, and especially if you're using something like timeout, you should also ask yourself whether or not you're ready to follow through with this, right? Sometimes even offering kids acknowledgement and praise because maybe there's a thought that kids should follow through and they should listen. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but sometimes offering kids acknowledgement for things that might seem simple and straightforward to adults can be difficult to do so meaningfully. So ask yourself whether or not you're ready to follow through with some of these strategies, which don't just include timeout, but also include like, are you ready to follow through with offering your kid meaningful, positive attention for completing what you asked them to do? Okay, so the first one is time in. We're going to talk about this strategy called DRIP. It's an acronym that we'll go through. When I think of DRIP, I think of like you're developing a nice positive environment for kids, giving them less of a reason to not follow through. And by that way of thinking, giving them more of a reason to follow through. I think of like, my daughter was actually helping me put together some of these slides. And when I asked her about this, she's like, you mean like love? I said, oh yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about love, right? Like it's a positive interaction between teachers, parents and kids that emphasizes things that kids do well, right? And so she suggested we put like a picture of a heart, and I don't disagree with that, right? So what is DRIP? It's different ways of providing positive attention that teachers can incorporate at different times of the day, that parents can incorporate especially during instances parents know kids are more likely to be non-compliant. Examples of this might be things like when you're on the phone or when you're out shopping or when it's almost time to get ready for bed. These are whenever you think there's a higher chance kids are not going to follow through, those might be pretty good examples of scenarios where you might consider adopting some of these different strategies that are, I think, fairly straightforward and simple. So the first one, D, is for describe. When we teach parents to do this, what I try to emphasize is that you're not really judging a kid's behavior necessarily as good or bad. You're just trying to create an environment where they know that you're watching, not like in a punitive or threatening sort of way, but that they know you're paying attention. For those of you that have kids, it's a really good sign when your kid is coming up to you and trying to show you things that they enjoy. Hey, dad, look at this. Hey, mom, look at this. Hey, dad, I want to show you this. And again, with a 4.5-year-old, like I feel like my daughter does this like a ton, which is a good thing. Although, like to be honest, right, sometimes it can feel like even that is a lot of work, which is why I emphasized at the beginning, like make sure you can follow through with some of these strategies if you're going to try to incorporate them. But what I usually encourage parents to do here, without offering judgment of whether behavior is good or bad, is to narrate, right? When I think of narration, I think of like Morgan Freeman, right? Narrating in movies or whatever. Like it doesn't have to be that good, right? But you are at least describing what it is that they're doing because it will show that you're paying attention to them. Examples, simple examples, right? Like, John, hey, you're sitting real quietly in your seat and you're paying attention, right? You could offer some, consider that maybe more like praise if you're going to say like, hey, really good job. I enjoy this. I like this. But there could be other things that your kid is doing that you can describe and narrate. Hey, you're bouncing the red ball. Like sometimes I go in my daughter's playroom and I play with her and I just want to show that I'm paying attention to what it is that she's doing, right? Like, I don't know how often we can play kitchen or whatever and like cook stuff for it to stay fun. For her, it seems like forever, and that's fine if that's what it is that she wants to do. But in that setting, then, even if it's not necessarily like amazing for me, the 100th time, I can still continue to provide descriptions of what it is that she's doing. Hey, nice job cooking those vegetables. Or, hey, you're cooking those vegetables. Hey, you're putting those toys away. Hey, you're moving your red cars, right? Like anything that involves a description of what it is that kids are doing would be considered just this narration or description as a part of drip and time in. The second piece is reflect or repeat. I think of this as like echoing what kids say. Sometimes it's hard to know, I think, for parents whether or not what they're saying is necessarily good or bad. Most verbalizations for kids, especially for young kids, tend to be neutral. Offering a repetition of what they say is enough, similar to descriptions, to show that you're paying attention to them. Here are some examples in a classroom. Teacher, I just finished this whole worksheet. Yep, you did just finish that whole worksheet. And you're not going to like use that with like a 17-year-old necessarily, right? The 17-year-old might look up at you like what's happening here, right? But for young kids, kids 4 or 5 or younger, you can just say, yeah, you did finish the worksheet. If you have a kid and you're playing with them, hey, my car drives fast. You just repeat that. Yeah, your car definitely drives super fast. Seems maybe overly simple, right? These things by themselves don't necessarily increase compliance, but when they're used systematically, they become more of a habit, especially when kids are more likely to be non-compliant. Then you'll start seeing changes in kids' behavior with the use of some of these strategies. Another one, the I in drip, is for imitate. So you want to essentially just mirror, maybe I should put that mirror picture here, essentially just mirror what it is that kids are doing within the context of appropriate behavior, right? You don't want to mirror problem behavior the same way you don't want to model problem behavior to other kids or to your kids in particular. But typically when we ask parents and teachers to think about this stuff, especially with parents, we ask them, can you set up 5 to 10 minutes of your day where you're just playing with your kid? Even if it's not the most fun thing for you, just let them play and start incorporating some of these little drip related strategies. So while they're playing, you may not necessarily know whether I should be describing something or whether you should be praising something, which is what we'll get to next. Right? Maybe your kid isn't speaking as much and there isn't much to reflect or repeat, but you can imitate what it is that they're doing with regards to their play behavior in this example, and imitate like things that you find to be a little bit more appropriate, like when they share while playing, when they bring you toys. You can offer them toys back. If they're moving cars backwards and forward, you can mimic that and mirror that, imitate that. Again, it's just another way of showing that you're paying attention to what it is that they do, what it is that they're doing, and that you care about what it is that they're doing. Last but not least is praise. And this is probably the most important one, I'd say, in particular because it's used after a positive behavior has been shown, right? So like you would incorporate this after a kid follows through with an instruction that you give them. There are ways, though, to make praise more effective. When I think of praise, I think verbal interactions, although they could be written. I don't know if you necessarily do that for younger kids, right? But regardless of age, and this is true even for teenagers, people like to be acknowledged, right? It sort of boggles my mind sometimes when people talk about how older kids or college students don't like to be acknowledged in some way, shape, or form, when really the research doesn't support that. It's sort of this misconception, I feel like, especially in middle school and high school. Like, should we praise our kids for following through with instructions? Like, yeah, absolutely. You definitely should, if for no other reason, because they aren't already following through. And it's clear they maybe need something else to make that contrast between the value they get out of compliance and the value they get out of non-compliance. In any case, though, here are some recommendations from this research involving how to make praise more effective. In general, we like praise to be more what's called behavior specific. So all praise involves some form of acknowledgement. Something like good job is acknowledgement. We would call that more general praise, though, because you're not specifying what it is that the kid is doing a good job with or in. In contrast, maybe something like good job putting the toys away. When you add that piece of acknowledgement to the description of the behavior, it just helps bring clarity to kids with regards to, hey, this is what this person likes me doing. It's specifically this. It creates a clear connection so that if you're using this in the classroom, not only is that one kid likely potentially to engage in those behaviors again, but other kids see that as well, right? So it's really beneficial for teachers who are managing, 25 different kids at any given moment to offer behavior specific praises for no other reason because other kids see that specification and know, hey, those behaviors are likely to recruit praise. Maybe I should engage in those behaviors as well. So behavior specific praise, tons of research to support this. We also encourage parents and teachers to focus on behaviors that are more effortful versus like intrinsic sort of skills or competencies that kids might have. Like we don't really necessarily encourage parents to focus on praising their kids for being smart, right? Like something that, depending on who you talk to, is a more stable construct. But things that maybe they're related to task completion, like, hey, I really appreciate you trying to complete what I asked you to do. I really like that you're working hard on this assignment. I really like that you listened and brought your toys back, even though I know some of those toys were kind of slippery or heavy to carry back to your playroom. So focusing on effort, specifying the behavior. When the behavior does occur, as it relates to compliance and really any other behaviors, you want it to be as immediate as possible. The sooner the better, so that kids can make the connection with, I did this and I got this acknowledgement. I did this and I got this acknowledgement over and over and over, so the two become sort of synonymous to kids. And then lastly is meaningful. And this could be mean different things for kids of different age groups. For young kids, I would say that it's okay to show a little bit more enthusiasm. Kids tend to respond positively to that sort of thing. It gets their attention a little bit more. And if for no other reason, enthusiasm is important, because if you think about what typically happens for kids who are non-compliant, kid doesn't follow through, parent says or teacher says, hey, you got to go do this. Hey, I don't want to do this. Yeah, but you have to, because I said so. And it turns into this loud argument, power struggle. But the loud piece is there, that is what I want to emphasize in terms of why being meaningful and enthusiastic with young kids is important. If you're creating a contrast between the amount of incentive kids get for compliance versus non-compliance, one way you can create that contrast is by at least focusing on different ways to increase the value of something as simple as praise. So not just more praise, but like if you look at qualitatively how loud your reprimands are, most parents and teachers raise their voice when they start reprimanding kids over and over. If you're enthusiastic with your praise, you can now compete with that a little bit better. Here are some examples of what praise might look like. Thank you for raising your hand. Acknowledgement with a specific behavior. You're doing an awesome job. Acknowledgement. Staying near the shopping cart, which is a common concern parents report, right? Because kids wander off and, hey, look at that. Hey, look at that. You're doing a great job sharing your building blocks, right? Acknowledgement with a specific behavior, specifying other kids with Kyle during today's activity time. Okay, so drip, describe, repeat, imitate praise. Praise is probably the most important piece here because it involves descriptions necessarily if you're using behavior specific praise, and you can use it strategically after kids are able to follow through with your instructions. Okay, so that brings me to the next strategy, which is effective instruction delivery. So if time in is meant to create a more positive environment, puts kid in a position to be more successful, offer some kind of incentive for following instructions, EID is also meant to put kids in a better position to follow through with instructions. All EID is really is a different way of giving instructions. Most parents and teachers do some of these things listed here, but not all of them, and not usually together in combination, not as consistently. Okay, but based on really decades of research, we know that when parents and teachers can incorporate these steps together, kids are more likely to follow through with instructions that they're given. So let me go through this. I putting together this table, I remember thinking, God, that's a lot of words. Like, I don't want to have a slide like that. That's a no-no, is what my daughter would tell me. But to keep things as simple as possible and to offer some level of instruction for folks who are trying to incorporate this, I think this could potentially be useful. So let's go through this. I want to focus on the green first, because these are the pieces that tend to be more important, which is evidence in a lot of the research. Okay, so first and foremost is when you give an instruction to a kid, it's important to give a directive versus asking them a question. That's not to say that you should use this all the time or you shouldn't ask kids to do things, but consider again the settings in which kids are more likely to be non-compliant. Those present themselves as opportunities to use some of these strategies listed here. But that doesn't mean like you should just always tell them what to do and never ask them what to do, right? Parents often express concerns about, like, am I showing good manners and those sorts of things? And those things are important, right? So just keep that in mind, right? You're not using this 100% of the time. It's really when kids are more likely to be non-compliant. Give a directive, not a question. Clearly state what you want your kid to do. Tell them, don't ask them, right? Hand me the ball versus can you give me the ball? It would not be something I would suggest. Asking a question gives kids an opportunity to say no, right? And lots of kids will take that opportunity or ask you questions in return, like, why should I have to do that? Right now it turns into an argument and they're just delaying following through. So tell them what to do. It's important that they comply. That's why you're trying to use this. Don't ask them what to do. Offer some level of description. You want to make it as clear as possible to kids what it is that you're wanting them to accomplish. Oftentimes what we see is like parents say, go clean your room. For young kids, you want to be a lot more specific than that, right? Go put your toys in the red toy bin. Offer some level of description so that kids have a clear understanding with what's expected to them. I sometimes I fall for this, right, where I don't offer enough description with my daughter, and I'll come back and after asking her to pick up toys in her playroom, I'll find that like all the toys have just been moved somewhere else in the playroom when I should have said, put those toys in the closet in your toy bin. And more often than not, she'd follow through with that level of description that's added. The other thing I want to emphasize here is when kids are being asked to do things, is to offer a quiet tone voice. You want to stay as neutral in your tone of voice as possible. And what that can do for you is when you offer behavior specific praise for compliance and you're enthusiastic, it makes a bigger contrast between your statement or command and the praise and incentive that you're offering them. It just makes it seem a lot better. The other thing worth mentioning are to use positive commands or do commands instead of don't do commands. This is probably where parents, in my experience at least, parents and teachers have the most difficulty with changing. Usually because disruptive behavior, non-compliant behavior, squeaky wheel gets the oil sort of thing. Parents and people in general tend to notice problem behavior much faster than they do or positive behavior. So by the time those behaviors occur, parents and teachers are telling kids to stop doing stuff. We want to flip this a little bit and give them something more active to do instead. So when kids are up out of their seat in the classroom, instead of, hey, stop getting out of your chair, right? You just tell them what they should do instead. They've got to fill up that time somehow and be clear about it. Please sit back down in your chair. Some teachers offer some specification to this, like with your butt in your seat and your back up against the back support. If you got kids at home jumping on the bed, jumping on the couch, instead of, hey, quit jumping on the bed, hey, quit jumping on the couch, it's put your feet on the floor, right? Something that is more active, using a do command instead of don't do commands. Last, at least of those steps highlighted in green, is this chance now to give kids to think about what it is that's being asked of them. If using positive commands are where teachers and parents and teachers tend to struggle most, waiting is an easy number 2, if not like a 1A here. It is very common to see parents and teachers give an instruction and then like immediately repeating that instruction, almost as though they're expecting kids to just jump out of their seat or jump out of their bedroom and start complying with the request. It almost never happens. And I usually ask parents and teachers to think about like how quickly do they start complying, initiating, or completing an instruction? Do they get up right away? Like when your significant others ask you to do things at home, are you jumping out of your chair to take out the trash right away, right? Or are you waiting until commercial or something, right? Like most people don't respond immediately like this. Okay, give kids at least 5 seconds to think about what's being asked of them. Some people might ask, like, well, why 5 seconds? Why not 10 or 15? It's a really interesting sort of question, I think. Based on the research, here's what we know to be true about this wait interval period. If you give kids 30 seconds to get started, most kids will get started with those instructions at like second number 28 and 29. If you give kids 20 seconds, most kids get started with what you're asking to do at seconds 18 and 19. And that pattern continues with if you give kids 15 seconds, if you give kids 10 seconds, kids get started at seconds 8 and 9. So it's like kids are waiting till the last minute until, in general, based on the research that's available with this, depending on how much time you give them, what we know tends to be pretty effective is less than 5 seconds might be difficult to start some commands, but most one-step instructions that you're giving young kids can at least be started within 5 seconds. So this is what we usually recommend in clinics and in the classroom. What I would recommend: give kids at least 5 seconds to think about what it is that's being asked them and to get up and get started. Okay, some other things that you could add in here to this that will make these things more effective. These things alone can be really effective, but if you add some of these other steps here, you do increase the chances of seeing a kid who's more likely to be compliant with your instructions. First one here is stand close. With parents, I usually tell them within 2 feet of proximity. In the classroom, with teachers, anywhere between 3 to 5 feet seems appropriate. Don't stand across the room. This is important because it shows that you're just more of a focal point with when the instruction is being given. And if you are incorporating timeout and you have kids who like run off and potentially leave the bedroom because they don't want to complete your instruction as a parent, you can control access to where the kid is now in the environment. The other thing too about standing close to kids is, imagine a kid is playing, like to use my daughter as an example, and I'm asking her to start cleaning up her toys in her playroom. She's constantly playing, constantly playing. She hears me and she says, "Yeah, I'll do it right now," which is, I think, what a lot of kids say. If you're closer to them, now you can start to think about how you can direct their attention back towards you with some of these subsequent steps. You can't complete these subsequent steps if you're across the room, right? Specifically, I encourage parents in particular to try to obtain eye contact before giving your target instruction. So you don't have to do this. You should also think about like what's developmentally appropriate, like culturally appropriate, if this is something you want to emphasize. But the basic premise behind including something like this is you're giving them a really easy instruction to follow through with. You're ensuring that you have their attention and that they're ready to listen to your actual target instruction that comes next. Then when they follow through, you can offer them some praise, right? "Hey, thanks for listening to me." Right? This would look like, "Hey, John, look at me. Thanks for looking at me. Pick up your toys, put them in the red toy bin." Right? That's essentially what this whole thing would look like in combination. When you solicit eye contact, it ensures you have their attention, and it creates a little bit of momentum, so to speak, with setting them up for the directive to come. This is another piece that maybe you don't necessarily have to use in classrooms. We don't necessarily use this as much. Guided compliance: if a kid doesn't look at you, you say, "Hey, John, look at me." They don't look at you after waiting 5 seconds. I would usually encourage parents to maybe gently guide the kid's chin in the direction of your eyesight. With teachers, though, there's the idea of like putting hands on kids is always, to me, sort of a problem, even with parents in some cases. So in that case, what we would emphasize is at least try to get in their eye line, right? If they're looking at toys, block viewpoint of the toys and get into their eye line there. These are other steps that you don't have to include. I would still encourage all parents and teachers to stand close to their kid. Definitely follow through with these. And then, of course, when they do follow through, if you care about them starting quickly, offer them some really meaningful behavior specific praise. "Hey, I really liked that you stopped playing and got up and started cleaning up your bedroom right away. Thanks, that's awesome. High five." You throw in like nonverbal gestures. If you're concerned about them completing the task, "Hey, nice job cleaning up your room today. That was really good. I like that you listened to me right away and managed to get this done pretty fast. Nice work." So this is EID in combination. If you're thinking about how can you practice this, I would emphasize, again, going back to how you can practice time in and drip, setting up like a little 5-10 minute period time during the day with kids at home where you're just focused on interacting with them and using drip. You're not necessarily telling them what to do just yet until you're comfortable with how well you use drip and how frequently you can use the pieces of drip. And then over time, start incorporating very simple commands within the context of those play activities by using even maybe a handout like this to go through EID. Okay, so back to that flow chart we talked about earlier and how it offers a conceptualization, right? Let's think about where time in and drip and EID come into play here. If you just use EID by itself, you'll increase the chances kids will follow this sort of pathway here. Okay, but if that occurs within the context of all this love, which is how my daughter would explain it, or all this time in and drip, now you're just putting kids in an even better position to follow this pathway. Combine that with some sort of meaningful, positive attention like behavior specific praise, where the value is higher now because you've established yourself, or at least increased the value of your attention as a reinforcer to kids. The value here now is really high. You can be more consistent with this. You, at the very least, what you're set up to do now is to compete with all the incentives and reasons why kids might be non-compliant. So again, like we haven't even addressed like what parents and teachers might do to address non-compliance and reduce the value for the incentives kids get for being non-compliant, right? But at the very least, by incorporating time in and drip, effective instruction delivery, including the behavior specific praise that follows compliance, you're in a better position to compete with what kids already get access to for being non-compliant. By itself, it can increase compliance substantially without having to use any punishment strategies. That being said, I'll just mention real fast, this is more of a complete compliance and non-compliance flowchart that incorporates time in and drip, like we've already discussed, and behavior specific praise. But there are things that we would usually coach parents and do when using a timeout. Timeout is just time away from time in. It doesn't have to be a timeout chair or, for a specific amount of time necessarily, but that's a really different conversation. I think once starting with, if parents and teachers get comfortable with using time in, drip specifically, EID, offering some positive attention for compliance, putting kids in a better position to follow through, non-compliance will go down by itself. You might get to a point where you still need something like timeout, but this by itself can be pretty effective overall. I can open it up to questions.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. That was amazing. Best webinar ever, I think. Like, I mean, seriously, it was. It was so practical. We can implement everything, especially for parents and teachers that are working with kids. This is amazing. So the age here is not mentioned, but how should parents respond when a child keeps talking back? Do you ignore it or address it at the moment?
Good question. This is a really good question. It's a very common question too. Goes back to like that very beginning when we talk about what is it that you care about? Do you care about them following through with usually a motor related instruction where the kid has to get up and actually go do something? Or do you also, in combination with that, care about what kids say to you while they're getting up and doing it? I think it's generally easier for parents if their focus tends to be more on, well, do they actually do what it is that we're asking them to do? And in those situations, the answer to that is yes, I would just ignore what it is that they're saying back to you, because it's not what they say, it's what they do. If they follow through with the instruction and you're telling me as a parent, like that's what it is that you care about, then who cares what they say? They can say whatever, right? If it interferes with them completing the instruction, then maybe you make it a focal point, right, of intervention. This is where like maybe something like timeout would come back into play. But in most cases, I usually just tell parents and teachers, just ignore it. Eventually they'll stop because they're not getting anything out of talking back to you anymore. In the past, talking back to parents and teachers creates an argument, right? It's, I don't want to do this. I hate you. You're the worst parent ever, whatever kids say, right? Sometimes they say really hurtful things sometimes, but they do. But what ends up happening is parents respond to those verbal opposition behaviors, right? And now it's an argument. And that whole time you're in this power struggle with a kid, those kids are just delaying having to start this task. And just delaying having to start the task can be pretty valuable. Think about procrastination, right? Like people push things to the last minute. That's essentially what they're doing. If they can get you to bite on that verbal opposition and now you're arguing with them, well, now the instruction is like 10 minutes ago, which is not what we wanted. We wanted them to follow through, start within 5 seconds, complete within 30 seconds. So short answer to that question is I usually encourage parents and teachers to just ignore it.
Great, thank you. Do reinforcers, like other than offering praise, I think, help children comply?
Definitely. The reason why I think we focus more on positive attention and behavior specific praise specifically is because it's really efficient. It doesn't cost anything, right? It's just a little bit of effort involved with that. It's transportable. You can take it anywhere. Teachers in particular, right, might use like treasure boxes at school. And we always say like who had to pay for that? Usually teachers. We don't want that. We don't want people having to pay for some of this stuff. Most kids like the attention that you can provide. The problem is that they haven't experienced it enough to know that they like it. At the very least, even if you have a kid who maybe doesn't enjoy your attention as much, if you're going to incorporate other like more tangible incentives, you can, but you should still use praise with those incentives so that eventually you don't have to keep incorporating all these other toys and tangibles. So other incentives can work, although how you identify those incentives are really important. I'll just say a few things about this. Parents and teachers are really good at identifying one or two things that kids really value, but how you deliver those things really matters in schools. And with parents, I usually ask them to stay away from edibles for dietary, nutrition related concerns. And also because kids get filled up on that stuff right away. So the other thing too is like you don't want to spend a lot of money on this stuff, and it's worth thinking about like how you give access to a kid to an iPad if that is in fact what they want. And those things present their own challenges. They can work, but at the very least, I would say use praise with it, if not by itself.
Is it possible to diagnose ADHD in a hyperactive 2-year-old?
That's a good question. Um, I can't say that it would be necessary to do something like that. And I don't think that really you could reasonably do a thorough assessment in a 2-year-old, mainly because ADHD has to occur across context. And when we're assessing school age kids, we have two very easy contexts in which to assess these behaviors related to ADHD: at home and at school. And if you're only at home, like most 2-year-olds are, it's really hard to get a sense of whether or not these behaviors are what you call like pervasive or chronic, right? Like that they're widespread and they occur everywhere regardless, because ADHD is a chronic condition and it would show up pretty much everywhere a kid would go. But if you're only at home and with certain parents, then it'd be hard to assess for that. So when doing these sorts of evaluations in clinics, we usually wait till kids start school at the earliest. But that doesn't mean that like these sorts of strategies and behavior management strategies still wouldn't be beneficial for a kid who's potentially going to be diagnosed with ADHD down the road.
So kind of along those same lines, why would a child be compliant at school and not at home or vice versa?
That's such a good question. Oh my gosh, whoever asked that question, that's such a good question, because you get this all the time. Like teacher calls parent at home, telling parent like, "Hey, your kid's not listening." The parent's like, "Oh, what are you talking about? My kid's a saint," right? Or vice versa, right? Kid's a saint at school, and the parent's like, "What?" Like, right? What that's telling you is that there is a very clear difference in the kid's environment at school and at home. So if I'm going back up here to this little basic flow chart, if you have a kid who's more compliant at school, what that's telling you is that the teacher is doing a really good job of putting them in a position to follow this pathway here. Maybe they're offering more incentives, right? A different combination of incentives, tangibles, praise, activity reinforcers, recess, right? Line leader stuff, clean the whiteboard stuff, right? Ultimately, what it's telling you is that kids at school in that scenario are being put in a really good position and given more of a reason to follow through with instructions than they are at home or vice versa.
Okay. Now let me fit in my own situation.
Okay.
Okay, 3.5-year-old. So we used to go to the store before COVID. COVID hit, didn't take her to the store for a long time. Then we see these cute little carts at Trader Joe's, take her to do the cart. Everything goes great. She does the grocery shopping. Next time at the store, she went totally nuts, ran all over the whole store screaming, putting everything in the cart, just going crazy. We give her a talk. We say, "Are you going to listen? Remember how good it was the first time, this and that." Second time to the store, she actually bolts out of the store, through the doors, almost into the street. So now she doesn't go to the store. Is it a bad thing that we decided no store until she can understand better? Or do we continue to socialize her in the store and go through this hell for us?
Yeah, no, I trust me, I understand 100% what you're experiencing. It's a conundrum, right? Because you want the socialization piece, but you can't have kids running out for safety reasons. It's funny. So I think this question kind of comes back to like what it is that you feel like you care about as a parent. Like, if you're going to continue to place high value on that socialization piece, you might consider like, are there other ways to still encourage that socialization piece without having this risk of elopement and potential safety concerns, like maybe taking them to other types of places. But if for some parents that wouldn't be feasible, right? Like I have to go to the store, my kids need to come with me, and so you're just kind of left with what it is. What I would say in those situations is, in addition to a couple strategies I'll mention, particularly for young kids, I don't think explanations are necessarily bad for young kids, but there is a chance kids don't understand always. Um, but more importantly, understanding may not actually lead to changes in behavior, right? How many things as adults do we know that we shouldn't do and we do, or vice versa, right? Like understanding won't always lead to changes in behavior. Also, experience tends to be a better teacher for people of all age groups. The specific sort of strategies I think there, because it's a common concern for parents, not just because of COVID, are a couple things. One is before going into the store, just stating sort of the expectations, like, hey, when we go in, I want you to stay near the cart, right? And then if you know that your kid has an increased chance of not staying next to the cart, this is like a perfect opportunity for a parent to think, this is where I'm going to sprinkle in some time in, some drip, and some incentive. As soon as we walk in the store, hey, thanks for staying next to the cart, right? And that sort of acknowledgement is now just more robust or more frequent. Instead of waiting every 10 minutes, like some parents might do, it's like every minute or every 30 seconds, right? Because you know that there's an opportunity here that your kid's going to feel like they're going to need to run out. You're trying to beat them to the punch a little bit, offer them some reason to stay close to the cart by giving some time in and some behavior specific praise here.
Great suggestion. And I think we have time for maybe one more question. This kind of fits in with what one of the other people asked. If there's anything else you wanted to add to it, she said, how does one handle blatant noncompliance in public?
Ooh, okay. So I might need a minute or two to answer this. It is related. So one of the other reasons why parents might be concerned about taking their kids to the store isn't just because of like COVID-19 or kids eloping. It's, well, I'm not comfortable having to manage my kid's behavior in public because there's like this, like other people are looking at me type of thing. And there's a little bit of pressure, right? And people don't want to deal with that. And I understand that 100%. I still think if this is something that you have to do, taking your kids in public to the store, that, and this is something that's still important to you, even if you don't have to do, go ahead and still do it. This is where I think it's important, though, for parents to think about, are they comfortable using these strategies at this point, right? If you don't feel very well equipped yet, keep practicing these things at home until they become a little bit easier, your flow is a little bit better, you're a little bit more of a master at using some of the stuff, and then bring it out to other settings versus like being left with, I don't know what to do because my kid is just acting, like there's a whole temper tantrum here. And now people are looking at me. So first get comfortable with this stuff and then start taking it out into public settings. The other thing too, though, I usually tell parents or encourage parents to think about is we all feel embarrassed when we're having to manage our kids' behavior out in public, right? But there are times though when I'm out in public and I see parents who like are waiting kids out, like not giving into their kids and basically using some of these strategies. And I just want to go up to them like, you're doing such a good job. Like, I know it feels like people are watching you and they are, and they're judging you and they are, but like, you're doing such a good job actually using these strategies by not giving into what it is that this kid is doing. So even if there are people judging you and like, my kid would never act like that. And like, I would never do that as a parent. It's like, they're not you and they're not having to deal with your kid's behavior is what I would remind parents of and say, just focus on the strategies that you're now comfortable with, that you practice with at home. Keep doing what you're doing, and who cares about some of these other things? As long as there aren't safety concerns to other people, then you're actually doing the right thing by not giving into them.
Everything was perfect. You've done an amazing job. This content is so helpful and so amazing. And so I wish we had time to just keep on talking, but it's one. So I'm going to offer our sincere thank you to you, Dr. O'Hanley, for speaking with us today, and to all our attendees as well for being here. The webinar was hosted by the Institute for Child Development and Family Relations at California State University, San Bernardino, where we provide guidance for parents and families based on science and best practice. And we've been doing that since 2002. To hear more from us, please like us, follow us on Facebook, visit our YouTube page where all our previous webinars are available. And you can also visit our website, csusb.edu/ICDFR. So thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful day and be well.